before, so probably most people know me. I'm Nazneen Rahman, and I thought I'd start a little bit just telling you a little bit of a journey of how I got to here and why I started the Sustainable Medicines Partnership. It's a very short journey, don't worry, an embarrassingly, shamefully short story, I would say, because I have to be honest, before 2020, sustainability really wasn't on my agenda. The climate change wasn't on my agenda. That's not because I didn't believe in climate change. It was almost because I did believe in climate change, and it still seemed at that point, if you ever saw anything, it was always about people who did believe it, people who were denying it, and I was clear where I thought the science was. So I really didn't engage in that debate very much, or in what was going on there. And then at the end of 2019, I found myself in the wrong conference, really. I thought I was going to something about digital innovation, but in fact it was about climate change and the climate crisis. And I was absolutely shocked, really shocked that, the urgency, what was happening, but also inspired because there were people there who were doing lots of different things and showing their innovations. So I was sort of wide-eyed, and I continued to sort of think about it, and I started really engaging in the topic. And what was also clear, there were many sectors represented in that conference, but there was really almost nothing on healthcare. So I started looking at it, and very quickly it was clear, and it has been clear, and I think people accept that the climate crisis is a health crisis, that there are all sorts of different impacts of climate change that are going to have negative impacts on the health of our populations. And therefore anybody in healthcare, it was going to be a responsibility for us to deal with that. But two things that I was really not aware of, that I became aware of then, this is the back end of 2019. So there'd very recently been a publication by Arup and Healthcare Without Harm that had, for the first time, made an estimation of the actual footprint itself of healthcare. And that had estimated that nearly 5% of global emissions are due to healthcare, and that's equivalent to the fifth largest emitting country. So a huge contribution. So we had this climate crisis that was causing a health crisis, and the healthcare industry that was needed to deal with it was making a major contribution there. So that felt like something that needed to change. And the second was this thing that the climate crisis is a health crisis. It's also an equity crisis. It's also a justice crisis. In America in particular, they've really sort of grasped on that, but all of the negative impacts of the climate crisis are differentially, negatively impacting the same areas of society that are always impacted. So this really called to me. So I've been a doctor for longer than it's polite to mention, and a scientist, and I had been part of the sort of genomic revolution from before the genome was sequenced, and part of the systemic change of going from when I started, we had to explain what DNA was, to now where DNA is just the synonym for blueprint. So really seeing what you can do with systemic change, and I liked it, actually. I like sort of bringing those things together. And the one thing one of many things, but a key thing that teaches you is that timing is everything. It doesn't matter how important something is or how brilliant the innovations are. If it's not the right time for it, it's really, really hard to have traction and change. And what was clear then as the decade was turning was that this decade had to be the decade where we make changes. But actually a lot of different things were aligning across all those different things. So it felt like a time where one could have action, and it's something I often say is I'm an actionist. I'm not an activist. I'm tremendously impressed by activists, but I'm somebody who needs to sort of make things with my hands and deliver on what the activists have been telling us for many years. So that was kind of my journey. So in 2020, I just switched, and I decided that I was going to commit this decade really to try and having an impact. And it was that combination of being able to be good for people, good for planet, good for business. Because I think that at the crux of what we have to make, and here it is a cultural change, it's a societal change. We have to live our lives differently. We have to do business differently. And the only way humans ever do that, because humans don't like change, is if it's easier and better to do it in the new way. So we have to make that work. So in 2020, I set up a company called UMaker. I haven't got time to tell you why it's called UMaker, but feel free to ask me afterwards. And it was at the heart of that, of trying to build science-based solutions that would really help to make healthcare good for people, good for planet, good for business. And so healthcare's big, so we wanted to think about what would be an area of real focus. And medicines felt a really good focus for a few reasons. One, medicines are really tangible, and quite a lot of climate change is really intangible. It's still really difficult to know how many emissions are something. We're always translating it into car journeys or sizes of elephants or whatever. But medicines, everybody knows about medicines, and they're very tangible to everyone in the world. It's also, it crosses all of healthcare, so it's relevant to all aspects of healthcare. And then it also lent into my background as a doctor, as a scientist, but also as a non-executive director on AstraZeneca, which I joined in 2017. So I had a sort of unusual combination of networks and knowledge there that felt that would be relevant and would be helpful in driving impact. So that's what I decided to work on, and started to talk to many people in this room and many others. And a couple of things became clear really quite early. The first was, though I was very late to this initiative, there were people out there, amazing, wonderful people, many in this room, who had been thinking about this, who'd been trying to drive change for 10, 15, 20 years. And I was kind of blown away by that. And one of the things I really wanted to do is let the sun shine on all of this and help to provide a forum whereby all of those innovations and energies could come together and be accelerated. So that was one thing. And the second thing was that the medicine supply chain and how we use medicines, how we make them, it's really complex. I mean, it's like, however complex you think it is, you think, and we often sort of draw these landscapes and you're thinking, okay, it doesn't go from A to B, there's kind of like B to Y in between, we have to put in there and going around here. So, and it was clear that in order to try and have traction there, we would need to have a partnership. We'd need to be able to work together. Otherwise, we were just not going to be able to have success. But it had to be a partnership that was different, certainly, from any partnership that I'd been in before, and I've been part of many, many partnerships, as I'm sure all of us have been. And typically, I'm sure it's true of all sectors, but in healthcare, there are silos that, for very good reasons, that make it really difficult to work together. And conflicts of interest are important, but they're sometimes they're so important that they sort of stop any kind of convergence of interests, and there were a lot of convergence of interests that we need. So we needed something where everyone could be engaged. It needed to be completely non-hierarchical. We would need to have the multi-billion-dollar companies and the new technology providers and the non-profits and the healthcare be able to talk and work together to drive that forward. It needed to kind of be light and action-focused, because otherwise we would have spent, a decade sorting out the sort of governance structure of those partnerships. So that seemed a little bit complex, but nevertheless it seemed absolutely essential. So that's where I got to about 18 months ago about that, and that's when we started to put together the Sustainable Medicines Partnership. And I have to say, when I envisaged it, if I had the sort of vision to do that, it would be exactly where we've ended up. But to be honest, I'm blown away that 18 months later, there are kind of 42 different organizations that have committed and are part of this partnership. And from there, it has been exactly as I kind of wanted, that we've got big corporations, we've got technology providers, we've got hospitals, we've got not-for-profits, all action-focused, all committed, all already showing they're all sort of pioneers, already collectively wanting to make a difference there. And I just wanted to, all the representatives here, thank you so much for doing that. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. We did set the whole of this up in the COVID era, because I'd sort of made this decision in like February 2020, and then in April 2020 we obviously all got locked down. So, and sometimes I'm meeting some people that I've worked with for over 18 months for the first time in the flesh today. Some are much taller than I anticipated, which often happens to me. So this is what we decided to work on, and I think it's an interesting thing about why have so many people decided to be part of this journey. And I think there are a couple of things that were quite striking as I was talking, and also led to sort of wanting this focus. There were some really unique but universal and what turns out to be really helpful aspects about this particular focus. So the first thing, which is very unusual, but nevertheless has been universal, is as I've gone out to talk to people, and I've talked to many, many hundreds of people over the last couple of years, and I said, you know, billions of medicines are just made and thrown away every year. Not one single person said, really? Show me the evidence for that. I don't believe that. And which is an entirely normal and reasonable response. And whenever you're trying to do sort of a big radical change, that's the normal response that people would have. Not a single person ever has said that. Everybody says, yeah, you know, would completely accept that. They even know it's true, or they would expect to be true, or whatever their angle in it, they can see that it's true. So that is really helpful, because when you're doing sort of radical change, you always have, or you usually have a step where you just have to get people to believe, to tipping point, enough people believe it's a change worth tackling. We haven't had to do that at all. No one has said that. The second thing was that really nobody was kind of working on it directly, even though it was a really big problem, even though lots of people wanted that change. A lot of people were sort of working on it indirectly because of one of those different things, but it hadn't had a single kind of focus where we were going to say, let's try and make this thing work. So again, that's kind of quite helpful, because what it meant that there were lots of people who were doing little bits of things, and quite often they'd sort of come across somewhere in the system where they couldn't scale it, or they had done something, but other people weren't doing it this way. So it meant there was a real cadre of people who were really actively working, but really kind of needed that network. They could see how they needed that partnership to move forward. So I think those are the two things that really helped. And of course, I think even since 2020, over the last couple of years, the amount of attention on sustainability in this gender has, you know, I'm not quite sure where it is on the curve, but it's steep. So I think it just reflects that this is a really live problem for many people for all sorts of different reasons. So really what we were able to do was quite quickly sort of articulate a very simple, so this is really the slide, is the only, I've never really had to say very much more than this when sort of laying out the landscape. So there are a lot of medicines made across the world, about 4.5 trillion medicines, and it is a very, very big industry, about $1.4 trillion. As I said, billions of effective medicines are discarded, unused, for all sorts of reasons that are kind of understandable in isolation, but lead to this big loss. There are lots of different reasons. Every single place across the making and the using of medicines, there are wastages. And then we've got these sort of multiple different negative impacts, which also turn out into multiple different opportunities. So you can turn these current lose-losers into win-wins. So there is just the loss of the medicines, and therefore the sort of avoidable waste of medicines and ways of helping people and bringing access to medicines. There's the huge financial cost that it comes from that. And then there's this huge environmental cost that comes both from the wastage and just the many ways in which we use medicines. So in terms of it being an important problem, I have to say I don't think any of us have had any difficulty in persuading people it's an important problem. And I think this central thing that in order to have any kind of traction, the reason probably it hasn't had that movement is that it absolutely needs this collective, what we've called stewardship and commitment and action. It's just impossible to do anything other than just slightly move the needle individually, but collectively we can make a very big impact. So the next stage to really do that, and particularly in a partnership like this where we really want everyone to feel agency and feel engagement, was sort of to articulate the problem that we wanted to address. And there were sort of two sides to this. Again, humans, we find big, hairy problems hairy and complex and daunting. So often what we try to do is sort of try and find one small bit that we can sort of feel that we can get our heads around. But if you're trying to drive systemic change, then you're inevitably not doing that. So what you're always trying to do with these things is try and find a way in which you can have a structure that people can feel, okay, I can get my heads around this. This feels relevant to me. I feel agency here. I could do something here. But it's honouring the complexity of the whole, so that together you can start to drive something really impactful. So we had a lot of discussions with a lot of different people around that, and that's how the sort of pillars of sustainable medicines emerged. I would say right up front, you could articulate this problem in many different ways. You could tackle this problem in many different ways. It's not to say that if something's not on this slide, it's not relevant for sustainable medicines, but it is to say that if we want to make medicines more sustainable, if we want to have impact, we have to tackle these, and they are interrelated, so many of the things that we're doing can address all of them. So those pillars are measurable impacts, having end-to-end visibility, having better shelf life for our medicines, using digital by default wherever we can, making sure wherever we can that every dose is used, and ensuring that the packaging that with our medicines is equally as sustainable. So that became our sort of framing for the partnership. The next real thing that we wanted to make sure, and when I was going around, people were saying, oh, Naz, you know, is it just going to be another talking shop? You know, we've been in so many. How is this going to be different? We need action. And I also needed action. I'm at the stage of my career where, you know, I need action in this 10 years, otherwise it's going to be for somebody else to be doing. And, you know, I like action. So we really wanted to have a frame that would allow us to do that. So this partnership is to deliver a program. So over the 4 years, till the end of 2025, we were going to deliver, so it gives us a really hard timeline, and everyone who knows me is, I'm always saying, you know, we've got a timeline here. We've got to make sure that what we're doing works in this time frame. So you might say, well, how can you do something short in that time frame? And the reason is you tackle foundational problems, and you tackle them in a way that will allow them to be scalable afterwards. And that, again, that really sat well with the partnership, because it's not even that what we're doing is pre-competitive, it's sort of non-competitive, because it's at these foundational type of concepts that we're operating, and we really haven't had any kind of issues around that. So there are sort of some guiding principles about how we operate, but there are sort of two things. We operate at two levels, and again, typically those two areas are often separated, but we've put them together. So the first level is that absolutely at that systemic level, we need new frameworks, new concepts that allow the issues around sustainability to be right at the heart of things. And really for us, that's having a different narrative around risk. So in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, the risk was all about the theoretical actual risk of the person in front of you. The risk of the health to that person, to what one's doing to the world and the climate in general, was not put into that risk equation. So, and as soon as you start to do that, you can have a risk-based sort of narrative, and that's important, obviously, in our sector. We're always wanting to minimize risk. And so at the heart, we need to have our new policies that will allow us to, as I say, do sustainable business, because it's just the best way to do that. And we often talk about regulatory things and how to influence those. I think as a scientist, essentially, we always want to provide evidence and data. So there are lots of different ways in which you can influence, and many different people in the partnership do that in many different ways. But essentially, what we want to do is generate information, generate good data, so people can make informed decisions, however they're potentially doing that. Because policy and regulatory changes cannot come out of a vacuum. They have to be driven by data, particularly in our sector. So there are these systemic level that we would want to build. And then the way to do that, and also in order to have scalable solutions, is to have really kind of exquisitely, specifically designed projects that would allow us to show how this could operate in the future. And so these are these specific solutions, and they have to be something we can do in 4 years. They have to target the 6 pillars of one or more of the pillars of sustainable medicines. And inevitably, in that sense, we're largely thinking about sort of data-driven solutions, because you can do those. You know, we're not building new machines. We're really focusing on standards and metrics. And also core, particularly as we go through the program, it's about what happens afterwards, having that scalable, those implementation toolkits. So we've done it like this. You know, if you want to do it like this, you can do it like this. Or even if you don't want to do it exactly like this, how we've articulated this, how we've described this, will give you useful information. So in your context or whatever, you can take that forward. So that's how the program is operated. So then we were thinking about sort of defining the strategy, and say this was all in the COVID eras. So we ended up having these sort of round tables, these virtual round tables, usually between 50 or 60 people on the town tables, and then we sort of put them out into different groups, and they ended up being sort of really successful. And these are a couple of the reports that we've now made available that would articulate the background and the roadmap here for Pillar 4 on digital by default, and circular packaging for Pillar 6. I should say we will send you around this information afterwards. It's also available on the website, and both of these are fully available. So any information you want afterwards, we will send around or ask us for it. And I think these were a particular success. I think we always had a waiting list for these roundtables, and we certainly found them incredibly informative and helpful. And I think it was a first way that people could talk across this very, very diverse partnership, had a chance to talk and mix with people that they would otherwise not be able to. And in some ways, the sort of virtual aspect kind of helps, because it's sort of inevitably sort of non-hierarchical, because everyone's kind of in their pajamas, in their homes, sort of you can't really tell. And so that actually, despite actually not being able to meet, we were able to really go forward in terms of driving forward that strategy. But of course, it then comes, the rubber hits the road, and we're now 3.5 years now to deliver on action. So we're now really at that stage where we're moving forward to the project. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavour of the projects that we're now starting to deliver on. So the first one is around Pillar 1 is these about having implementable measures. I think this is, with all of our things, we always start with a problem statement. What's the problem we're trying to solve? And then we can have the solutions around there. And this one is a one that's really sort of a real exemplar for the partnership. So it's really hard to change things that you can't measure. And for the medicine's carbon footprint, currently it's usually down with a sort of top-down based on how much you spent on it, which is a particularly poor surrogate for medicines, and occasionally from the sort of bottom up. So you have this top-down and bottom-up for a few medicines. But what we've sort of been developing is a kind of middle-out approach, is what we would call it. So it sort of exemplifies, because there are two things that we've done here. One is we've really leveraged a huge amount of innovation and work that's been done in all sorts of different aspects on individual medicines. And then we've developed a new sort of software way of scaling that out to cover kind of all medicines. Because from a healthcare perspective, you need to have a frame where you can compare all of your medicines in one go if you're going to make decisions between them. So the innovations we could lean on is from medicines manufacturing and green chemistry. We've got representatives, I think, from AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and I think BMS, all of whom, in fact, all of the medicine manufacturers over the last 15, 20 years have done really amazing science to make medicines greener. And in part, they've done that because if you can make medicines greener, you're almost always going to make it cheaper. So even before the sort of green agenda, you're reducing costs because you're making those, you're simplifying your processes. So it's a kind of one of those win-wins. So we were able to do that. They'd already had metrics, they were already validated. And again, that was important, because if you're wanting to drive change, you don't want to institute new things. You want to say, look, you're already measuring that thing. We can put that into a framework whereby if you're changing on that measure, we can see how that's going to have the impacts already. So you're already doing it. We just need to potentially disclose it, which may have some challenges, but then put it into framework about how you're going to compare them. So that was one side that we could do, and we've had really tremendous engagement from the manufacturers on that side. On the other side, what we needed was to be able to put that in within the health systems about how to try to think about how you're going to use that information. And of course, when you're making a healthcare decision, clinical effectiveness is absolutely king, always has to be king. Then you've got your cost effectiveness. And now we're putting in a third thing, which we've sort of called carbon effectiveness, because I like alliteration, who doesn't? But it's quite complex going from 2 to 3, and how are we going to sort of work those out? So going through in terms of so we had to have a tool, and as I say, when I said UMaker is a sort of one of the things we do is make software, so MCF Classifier is one of the tools that we've been making, which integrates these scaled out measures of the footprint of medicines, but puts it together with prescription use, with cost use, so that you can start to think about it and then put it in a sort of simplified system that is similar to how you're using your medicines. And over the next year, it was great because we had support from NHS and SBRI funding, so we were able to sort of lean into what was needed. And of course, in the UK in particular, there's a really strong and aggressive timeline for delivering on net zeros. So again, as I was saying, it's good timing for this kind of thing because people need it. So over the next year, we're doing a couple of things. Here in the UK, we're working with a whole load of NHS trusts. I think we've got Newcastle here, Great Ormond Street, the whole AHSN network. I'm not sure if they're here, have also been part of that, to sort of think about how we're going to use that frame, that sort of simplified system, to start thinking about how that fits into your medicines optimizations. In the US, the VA system, which covers about 9 million people across all 50 states, so is a really great system to have on board. They've had a polypharmacy tool to sort of de-prescribe where you've got over prescription that they've rolled out in many of their hospitals. And what we're able to do there is think about, okay, when you've got those savings there, bringing in a carbon metric there, so you can start to put those things together. So those are the sorts of types of things that we're able to do. And then with some of our other collaborators in sort of adding in extra things, we've got people like My Green Lab and What IQ, other kind of metrics that you could start to put in there, so you can start to sort of show how is that manufacturing process, what are the metrics that are going to show that you're actually making progress there. So I say this is sort of an exemplification of how, if you can sort of get the right people together and you can focus on something clear and foundational, that people, and certainly applying things that have been done in one context in a different one, that you can actually make quite a lot of progress quite quickly. So the second project is called Track More to Treat More, and this is this issue around end-to-end visibility. So I think I was a little surprised, actually, when I sort of got a little bit deeper into sort of medicine supply chain, that despite the fact that pretty much all medicines now are barcoded, and GS1, who makes those barcodes, and BSI, and Courtney is here, and things, have been doing a lot of work around that tracking, but actually, if we're honest, we really don't know where a lot of our medicines are, nor where they really need to be, and that really makes it difficult to get it in the right place and to make sure that they're used. But there's a lot of work going on again in the partnership. People like CPI and others are sort of have been piloting some of these tracking things to be able to have better visibility, and we just need to know that. And as I say, the biggest hurdle and the most expensive hurdle was actually serializing the medicines in the first place, and that bit's been done. So a lot of the work's been done, and it's now down to us to sort of leverage that. The other thing is we don't really have standardized frameworks for reporting these medicines. Different terms are used in different ways, and that makes it difficult to benchmark. It makes it difficult for people to know, okay, they're doing it this way, that looks good, but is that really relevant to me, or am I doing it differently? So having the standardization, I'm a big fan of standardization and simplification. It really helps people. And actually benchmarking is good. It really sort of internally, if people can see where they are relevant to their peers, it sort of allows a real sort of internal structure whereby people can move forward. But then there are also kind of ways in which we can apply deep analytics to do sort of better matching and forecasting. Of course, we've always been very conservative in healthcare. We don't want to run out of medicines, and that's become a real pressure. But that doesn't mean that we can't apply some of these approaches that are being used extremely well in many other industries, including also challenging industries like food, and Inventing Matthews here has been doing that for many industries, and sort of working together to try some of these out here in the partnership. As I say, small changes here could have really, really big impacts. And again, it's often daunting when you're thinking, how many things are being lost, because it's in the hundreds of millions or billions. But at the same time, that gives you huge opportunities to drive meaningful change. So the third project is around shelf life extension. I think this one has been one that, so there are different stages, as you might expect. This one is one that we haven't sort of quite found the sweet spot around what we should be sort of moving forward on. Now, so the headline thing that we're, again, very conservative, mainly because of how the approval process runs. And so the expiry dates are sort of not quite the expiry dates in that sense. And many medicines, it's lots of data showing they're safe and effective after that. And in many countries, just in the US here, and in COVID times, we sort of went in and used some of these post-expiry medicines and sort of revalidated so that we could use them again. And as I say, whenever you do something like this, it's always worth a lot of money, and there's a lot of medicines because medicine is such a big industry. Having said that, I think this is an area where there's kind of less consensus, I think. How big a problem is it? Where is the problem? What should be the solutions? And partly that's because we just don't have enough data here. So I think one of the things we certainly would do is just finding a little bit more what that data is, where is the problems happening, what are going to be the most important things to do. But for sure, there are proven cost-effective programs in doing this. And for sure, the current systems disincentivize at every step of it. If you wanted to extend your shelf life in that way, everything is acting against you. So that's, again, something where if you can sort of flip that on its head, you can start to have a sort of meaningful impact quite quickly. So I think this one was in some ways our first symbolic project, and then became almost sort of totemic, because absolutely everybody, in different ways often, has issues around medicines information. So currently, as we all know, every medicine pack has a paper information leaflet, and it doesn't matter whether that's in your own homes or is in hospitals. I don't know how many it is. This is a very conservative, over 100 billion a year. It's a lot because there are a lot of medicines. I think one of the things that was said during the COVID years, during I think 2021, the vaccines, the information sheets, if they'd been in the boxes, there was an exemption during that time, would have been, for Europe alone, would have been 4 times the height of Mount Everest. So these are really, really big numbers. Now, of course, I think sometimes it's not that we're against paper. If people need a paper information leaflet, sometimes people think, well, people don't have digital access, and that's fine. We should absolutely be giving people the information how they need it. But in 2022, and again, particularly post-COVID, the number one way that most people want to access things is to have digital information. And that allows all sorts of things. And so it's more for us, I think, about digital inclusion. You can obviously readily turn it into different languages. Many things you'd rather see a video. Currently, you have to have a sort of a pencil diagram of how to use an inhaler. I mean, it's hard to use an inhaler at the best of times. Most people would want a video. Or pediatrics, something Great Ormond Street have been really pioneering. We want children to be able to access. So I think this is more about digital inclusion around that is our sort of headline, but it is also true that those leaflets in themselves are sort of wasted response. They're hardly ever read, but they have on these knock-on effects that a number of the reasons that medicines can't be used again is the medicines are fine, but they've got the wrong leaflet in them, and so they can't be used. So once you start going into the details of these things, there are often many problems, but of course those are many opportunities. So here I think there are sort of 3 clear things that we're moving forward. They're also in the round table. First, I think, again, there's what can often happen. The information has to fulfill compliance, has to fill all the regulations, but in some ways, sometimes that can then mean it's not as patient-centred as one might hope, and I think that certainly has happened in this part of it. So having that essential patient-centred content in the way that people want it is one of the first things, and a digital-first information sheet that then can be printed, but is already set up to be able to be moved digitally. And then, as I said, actually currently we have to have paper leaflets, even in medicines like chemotherapies or injectables or things that are used in hospitals where we know that the information leaflet is not being given to the patient. And so that seems a good place to start thinking about actually not having them in there. And this is sort of a symbolic project also because it feels, really simple. You're like, just put a QR code on it. Or people say, well, what's the problem? But actually, once you're going under the hood and actually trying to make that work in practice across such a big area like this, it has to be done well, because I think probably everyone here is healthcare is science-based and data-driven, but it's mostly confidence-driven. If people don't have confidence in a new way, if they don't, we just don't use it. Everyone has to have confidence in it. And then the third area is really around sort of real-world data to sort of build transition roadmaps, and currently all of the industry representatives from retail, generics, and biopharma are sort of coming together to think how that might work, and lots of things are being tried, and it's great to sort of see that sort of coalition and sort of moving forward to have an integrated response. Because, as a patient or as a person, you really don't want to have to think about, what manufacturer made your medicine or your things. You just want to work for you. So a huge amount of energy, not just in the UK, across the world around this issue, which is great to see. But I think it's also is important to say there really hasn't been any meaningful change in this area for, well, this century. So we're a little bit behind the curve in digitising here. And there are so many different reasons to do this. As I say, this is a win-win-win-win. But in terms of the actual resources, just of the paper, and paper actually is itself becoming a scarce resource, will deliver on its own. So 5, this is called Donate, Don't Destroy. To be honest, I mean, I like alliteration, but I would rather it was kind of reallocate, don't destroy, because I think donation can have a bit of a pejorative term, particularly for the people receiving it. And also sometimes if you're having donation, it isn't a systems change, it's something as an add-on, and actually what we want is a kind of systems change. So again, billions of safe usable medicines are destroyed. This 10% is actually a US stat around that. Here, depending on where you're collecting from, sometimes you can reallocate it, sometimes you can't. There has been a lot of successful reallocation programs. One of the people in the partnership, PharmaSwap, have done a really great project, first in Holland, where it's allowing, if your pharmacy's got too much of a medicine, they can donate, share it with another pharmacy. And you're thinking, surely, isn't that just common sense? Yes, but as you might imagine, there are all sorts of reasons why that makes that very hard. Also very hard in the UK to do that, whether it's between hospitals or pharmacies. So again, when we've talked out to people, different people, pretty much everyone who has medicines is doing something on this, but how they're doing it and different things they're doing. A lot of people have put a lot of effort into their one medicine in a particular market, a lot of both legal and regulatory inputs. There's so much opportunity for bringing that together and bringing some kind of standardization about it. And at least if someone's gone through it, using that precedence, because precedence is so important in this area. Again, in COVID, we tried a lot of things. We've done huge real-world experiments around it and opportunities. And again, developing a bit of a more permissive regulatory environment so we can incentivize donation instead of destruction. And currently, it's very much the other way around. And then finally, there's packaging, and this is an area which is really a lot of excitement, a lot of movement. Halion, the sort of is something that have made really exciting, ambitious targets, and we're delighted that they've joined the partnership. Honeywell, also Walgreens. So this is a problem, and again, it shows you how society has changed. This has got a lot of eyes on it because people can see it, and they say, we see it, we don't like it. We want something different here. Please, can you do something different? But our packaging is not like everyone's packaging. It's performing a really important function, and function has to be the first priority in all sorts of different ways. That packaging is a core part of the medicine. So we have to have ways in which we're sort of delivering on function, but also reducing that single use. So again, a couple of things where we feel we can be really helpful here, and sort of learning from other lessons. So Of course, you should reduce wherever possible. That's always the heart and the start of things. You should redesign wherever possible. But for our packaging, there's going to be complex packaging that we are going to have to keep using. We can't swap it for biodegradable things, at least not in this decade. So we are going to need to have recycling solutions that will work on there. This is one of the ones that you absolutely have to work together, because you have to collect it. That's in one part of it. You have to sort it. That's all difficulty. It's made by one bit. It has to go to another bit. So unless you have everyone, that you just haven't got a hope. But two areas I think that we have been particularly focused on is what's called advanced or chemical recycling, turning back your complex plastics back into their molecular building blocks, essentially raw materials to be reused again. Complex for some of these things, but we've got people like Agilix and Cyclix who are doing this already for food waste, so and we're now trying it out with things like blister packs. And the second thing, again, coming back, we've got the very specific that will show whether or not it's possible, and then the systemic thing. So currently, for our type of packaging, you either can't or it's unclear whether you could actually use those raw materials back into manufacturing. Now, I think that it's all moving in that direction, but I think there are a number of things whereby, as a sort of neutral convener, we're as the SMP, we're trying to deliver the changes we want to see, and doing that through data-driven choices, and so that we can start to provide the evidence so that they can have confidence in people being able to use those back again. And we're prototyping that with sort of manufacturing waste, mainly because the further down you get, the harder it is to collect, it's bigger, but you also have medicine traces on it. There are various things. So, and there's actually a lot in that manufacturing waste where we can actually sort of, and already a lot of stuff being done. I think Livio, researcher, blister manufacturer, is also here and has been absolutely a sort of wonderful collaborator here in terms of taking that forward. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea about how we're operating, how we feel confident that with the structure that we have, the sort of science-based structure, putting together the partnership that are the people who can provide these types of solutions, and working together, the innovators, why we feel optimistic that we can make a difference. So just a little bit around, people sort of say, well, what is the SMP and how is it run? So the SMP is not a legal entity. We are a coalition of the willing. You Make My company is a sort of the executive secretariat of that. So we sort of run things like this and bring together all the sort of wonderful ideas and innovation into a sort of scientific strategy we can take forward. So the running of the program, our secretariat comes from corporate contributions. So the corporate members would pay, and that's just very transparently determined by the revenue of those companies. And then the projects themselves, there's sort of multiple diverse sources from that, and there are a couple of reasons for that. I think that we don't want to minimize our opportunities, but it was really more about the sort of engagement. So it's always good if people are going to have to put their pockets in the end to sort of deliver on something that they're right at the very beginning. They're thinking about how that could work, and so that you're leaning into delivering something that people have already decided that they needed. So as I say, with MCF Classifier, it's a real imperative for Green NHS to have some way. 25% of the carbon footprint of the NHS is in medicines. They need some ways to measure, so we were able to apply for that funding, and it spoke to them. As I say, there are other areas where we're sort of maximising that. So it's both to engagement and to harness all those stakeholder opportunities. So I've just got a couple more slides. I think it's important, as I say, that the reason this can happen now is because of where the world is, where the world has become aware of the changes we need to make in this decade. As I say, I don't think 5 years ago I would have got you all here today and got this support. Not because people didn't think it was important, it was because people didn't feel that there would be possibility to have the traction that we can have today. So I think that timing is important, and things like the Sustainable Development Goals is just one example of how we are just part of a much, much, much bigger movement. And for climate change, we either all win or we all lose. So we all have to do our bit as individuals or in any way that we can. And that's within healthcare, but as I say, as part of that broader remit. And I think one of the things we really want to do, and we've done a lot of it, is sort of bring learning lessons from other industries and other sectors, but also feeding that, and for healthcare to become ever more part of this global changes that we need. And of course, at the end, the things that we need to be doing, it has to be all about impact. And here, I think the sort of sustainable impact here is the key. What we want to do at the end of these 4 years is to have these toolkits, to have shown this evidence, to have driven forward changes, and actually, I think, just had new ways in which people can work together in different ways with different partners, so that we can start to stop billions of medicines being wasted, reduce millions of tons of CO2 emissions, stop billions of wasted healthcare expense. And I haven't talked so much, I think, as we get further on the programme, but the equitable access to medicines and equitable access to knowledge, both have been really important to me through my career, are also things that I think that we will and hopefully shall deliver on.